Welcome back to the deep dive. You've brought us a true mountain of material today.
I really have.
Sources covering the fundamentals, the architecture, and the surprisingly messy reality of machine learning and deep learning.
Right.
So we're going to try and distill this vast landscape into the core knowledge you need, what ML is good for, where projects typically fail, and the critical tools used to keep these massive models stable.
Oh, it's the perfect time for this deep dive because the field is just moving at an unbelievable pace.
It really is.
We're in the middle of what people are calling the machine learning tsunami. The sources point to the key starting gun being fired way back in 2006.
Right, with Jeffrey Hinton.
Jeffrey Hinton and his team, yeah. They showed they could train deep neural networks, a concept a lot of people had, frankly, abandoned, to get state-of-the-art results on, of all things, handwritten digits.
And that just proved the potential of depth.
It did. And once that potential was proven, the floodgates just opened.
Yeah, and we quickly started seeing these monumental, once-in-a-generation breakthroughs.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking specifically of DeepMind's AlphaFold. I mean, it essentially cracked the protein folding problem.
A decades-long, unsolved biological riddle. Just solved.
Incredible.
For a long time, ML was this quiet engine running underneath the hood, right? Improving your search results, optimizing logistics.
Screening production lines, things like that. Very discreet.
Very discreet. But then we had that seismic shift in, 2022 and 2023.
With the AI assistants.
The explosive public rise of AI assistants.
Yeah.
ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude. Suddenly, AI wasn't just a service enhancer. It became the central user-facing experience.
So what was once science fiction is now just daily reality for millions.
It really is.
So our mission today is clear. We're going to step back from the hype, away from the technical papers. We want to cut through the complexity of this tsunami, distill the essential concepts, and map out the practical strategies you need to execute a successful ML project. The focus is really on intuitive understanding, not the heavy math.
Let's start with the fundamental question that should precede any ML project. Why even use machine learning at all?
Right. Why not just code it yourself?
Exactly. The sources outline, I think, 3 key scenarios where trying to code the solution yourself is just inferior to letting a model learn it.
And the first one's about simplicity.
Yes.
If you have some legacy system that's based on thousands of complex, highly maintained rules,
like an ancient spam filter.
an ancient spam filter that's been manually updated for a decade, yeah. ML offers a way to simplify all of that. The model replaces that brittle, sprawling code base.
And usually with better performance and a vastly lower maintenance cost.
Okay, and the second scenario?
It addresses complexity itself. Sometimes the problem is just too difficult for humans to program a direct solution for.
Like image recognition.
Image recognition, complex natural language processing. The patterns are so intricate that traditional programming approaches just yield no good solution. So in these cases, machine learning is often the only practical way to find a workable answer.
And the third scenario is about resilience in a world that's constantly changing.
If your environment is dynamic, say predicting stock market fluctuations or customer behavior, a static rule-based system becomes instantly obsolete.
But an ML system can be retrained.
Easily and quickly on new incoming data. That lets it stay perpetually up to date. It can, learn on the fly.
Okay, so now that we know why we'd use ML, let's look at the foundational landscape, categorized by how the system actually learns.
The most common is supervised learning. This is basically learning with a labeled teacher. We feed the model inputs like photos.
And the desired outputs, the label.
Exactly. The label cat.
And this covers the majority of commercial applications, right? We're talking classification. Is it a cat or a dog? And a regression.
Regression, yeah, which is predicting a continuous value, like the precise price of a house.
Got it.
Then you jump into unsupervised learning, where there's no teacher, and the data is unlabeled. This is where the model has to infer the structure all by itself.
Clustering is the classic example here.
It is.
I love the example from the sources about analyzing blog visitors.
Oh, yeah, that one's great.
You run a clustering algorithm, and the system it automatically detects distinct groups of users based on their behavior, not on any labels you provided.
It's a really powerful discovery tool. The system might group 40% of your users and realize, this group reads these specific niche articles at this time of day.
And you look at that data and realize that's our core group of comic book-loving teenagers.
The model found the segmentation without ever being told those labels existed.
Yeah.
That's pure insight.
That sounds fantastic. But if unsupervised models can find these insights, why do we bother spending fortunes labeling data for supervised tasks?
Well, that's where the hybrid approaches come in. Specifically, semi-supervised and self-supervised learning.
Smart techniques to bridge that gap.
They really are. For example, in self-supervised learning, you create a proxy task. So imagine training a model to repair a corrupted image of a cat.
Okay.
To successfully put the pieces back together, the model has to develop an internal understanding of what a cat is.
So by forcing it to solve that repair puzzle, it gains understanding for free.
Exactly.
And that pre-trained understanding can then be transferred and fine-tuned for a much harder supervised task later, saving you tons of money on initial labeled data.
Precisely. It's a massive head start. Now let's shift to how the learning process itself occurs. We differentiate between batch and online training.
Batch learning is the traditional offline method, right?
It is.
You gather all the available data, maybe gigabytes of files, and you train the system all at once.
Like a random forest, yeah. It takes significant time, resources, and often very powerful hardware. Once it's trained, it's deployed, and it's static until the next batch update.
Okay, and online learning, by contrast.
Is incremental. You feed the system data sequentially, maybe one instance at a time, or in small mini batches. It updates its parameters on the fly.
What's the major practical advantage of going online? Is it just about speed?
Not just speed, but necessity. Especially in resource-constrained or real-time environments. If you're deploying a model on a smartphone or, going back to the source material on a rover on Mars.
Right, you don't have a data center up there.
You don't have the resources to carry a huge data set and train offline for days. Online algorithms, which are typically based on something like stochastic gradient descent, allow that application to learn incrementally and adapt immediately as new data streams in.
That transition from theory to necessity brings us right into the practical workflow. Let's look at the steps required to actually execute a project, using the California housing dataset as our running example.
Okay. Step one, before you touch any code, is framing the problem by understanding the business objective.
Right.
With the housing data, we're predicting the median price in a district. If that prediction is used by an investor to determine high-value acquisitions.
Okay, that tells us two things.
It does. First, it's a regression problem. We need a precise dollar value. And second, accuracy has to be extremely high.
Okay, now we have the goal. But the sources, they hammer home this one rule that sounds almost counterintuitive.
I know which one you mean.
Step 0 is avoiding the cardinal sin of data stooping bias. You have to create and set aside your test set before you do any other data exploration.
This is a rule that is broken far too often, and it can just doom a project from the start.
So why is it so bad?
Here's why. Your brain is a brilliant pattern detector, maybe the best in the universe. If you look at that test set early, even just casually, your brain might unconsciously guide your feature engineering or your model choices based on patterns you saw in that final untouched data.
It's like checking the answer key before you start studying for the test.
Exactly.
You haven't truly learned the material, you've just tuned your answers to fit the known outcomes.
Perfectly put. When you eventually run your model on that biased test set, the generalization error estimate how well you think the model will perform in the real world will be artificially optimistic.
So you deploy a system expecting 95% accuracy, and you only get 80%.
And then you have to explain why. Setting aside the test set guarantees that estimate remains honest.
So once we've locked away that test data, we still have to deal with poor quality data, which is a huge time sink for any data scientist.
Oh, it's where most of the time goes.
You've got outliers, those bizarre data points and missing features.
And handling missing features is a trade-off itself. You can discard the affected instances, you can fill them in or impute them with the median or mean.
Or even train parallel models.
You can, one for when the feature is present and one for when it's absent. It all depends on how critical that missing data is.
And this leads us to feature engineering, which
Yeah.
the sources call, critical to success.
It is?
This is where we stop taking the raw data as gospel and start transforming it.
Well, garbage in, garbage out is still true. Feature engineering is the art of making the data meaningful. It includes feature selection, deciding which attributes matter most.
And feature extraction, like using dimensionality reduction.
But most importantly, it's about creating new features.
Like in the housing example, the raw data gave you total rooms and total population. But the correlation metrics improved massively when they calculated rooms per house and bedrooms ratio.
Exactly. You didn't just use the data, you engineered better variables out of it. And that ability to combine and transform features is where domain knowledge truly shines.
So there's one final practical data issue the sources highlight, which is often overlooked,
Oh.
capping.
Yes, They found attributes like median income and the target value, median house value, were capped.
And capping the target value is a huge red flag. In the housing example, prices were capped at $500,000.
Right.
So if the business objective is investment decisions, the ML system will never predict a price higher than that cap, even if the real value is, say, $700,000.
And you must immediately go back to the client team and explain that the existing labels are inadequate. If the client needs accurate predictions above $500,000, you have to find the proper uncapped labels.
Otherwise, your model is essentially broken for the most critical high-value cases.
Completely broken.
Okay, so moving from data fidelity to model performance, we hit the central challenge of diagnostics, the bias-variance trade-off.
Right.
We're balancing simplicity versus complexity.
This is the bad model dilemma. Too simple, and you have underfitting or high bias. The model it's like an off-the-rack suit that doesn't fit anyone particularly well.
And if it's too complex?
Then you have overfitting, or high variance. This is the custom-made suit that fits only one person perfectly, the one it was tailored for, which is your training data.
So overfitting is the model wiggling around to perfectly match every single noisy data point in the training set.
Including all the errors and random fluctuations, it looks fantastic on paper.
But fails miserably in the real world.
Yes. To diagnose this, we use learning curves, which plot the error rate against the size of the training set.
Okay, so what do they tell us?
If both the training error and the validation error are high and close together, that tells you the model is fundamentally too simple. It's suffering from high bias or underfitting.
So you need a more powerful model or just better features?
Exactly. The classic sign of overfitting, on the other hand, or high variance, is the opposite. The training error is low because the model memorized everything.
But there's a big gap.
A large gap, yeah, between that low training error and the high validation error. That gap signals generalization failure.
And the fixes are also pretty clear. Simplify the model, get way more training data to drown out the noise.
And most commonly, apply regularization techniques.
Speaking of complexity, let's talk about deep neural networks, which are inherently complex. As we stack layers, training becomes precarious because of the infamous unstable gradient problem.
That's right. When you calculate the error signal and you propagate it backward through many, many layers, the gradients either get vanishingly small.
So the lower layers just stop learning.
They stop learning, or they explode. They become huge and send the whole algorithm off into chaos.
So we need architectural fixes to stabilize the stack. What's the most critical tool for this?
The sources really emphasize batch normalization, or BN. The technical description is dense, standardizing, rescaling, offsetting inputs.
Right, but the intuitive insight is that it's a stability layer.
It's a stability layer. It constantly checks and recalibrates the signal moving between layers.
So it's constantly ensuring the data stream inside the network stays predictable.
Yeah.
Which lets us stack layers like Lego bricks without the whole tower collapsing due to unstable signals.
It truly revolutionized how deep we could build networks. And to train these massive, stabilized deep nets faster, we need high-velocity optimizers. We've moved far beyond the basic iteration of standard gradient descent.
Instead of a slow, clunky car, we need something high performance. We hear names like Atom, Natom, SGD variants like Momentum and Nesterov. What's the main idea there?
Well, the core idea is smarter movement through the loss landscape. Simple gradient descent is like blindly walking downhill. Optimizers like Atom and Momentum are smarter because they remember where they've been. They either adjust their step size, that's adaptive learning, or they gain inertia, which is momentum.
To speed through flat regions and glide past small local minima.
Exactly. Getting to the optimal solution much, much faster than standard descent could ever manage.
And even with smart optimizers, we need smart training strategies like learning rate warm-up. Why do we start slow only to speed up later?
Imagine the loss landscape, the map the algorithm explores to find the solution. As the Himalayas, it's full of sharp, unpredictable spikes and valleys.
Okay.
If you start with a high learning rate, you just bounce around wildly and you might diverge immediately in these spiky areas.
So you start slow?
You start slow. Learning rate warm-up gives the algorithm time to stabilize, to move away from those treacherous high-loss spikes before you ramp up the learning rate for fast, efficient progress in the smoother, lower-loss region.
That's a fantastic picture of the process. Now let's circle back to two key applications of unsupervised learning and then look at the final step. Deployment. First, dimensionality reduction using PCA.
Right. PCA, or Principal Component Analysis, is our primary tool for compression.
Okay.
The beauty of PCA is that it finds the most informative directions in the data, the principal components, and allows you to ditch the rest, all while preserving most of the data's crucial information or variance.
The source material gives that incredibly memorable MNIST example, the handwritten digits.
Yes, the original images have 784 features, or pixels.
A lot.
A lot. By applying PCA and deciding to keep, say, 95% of the total variance, you can reduce the feature count down to just 154.
Wow, that's less than 20% of the original size.
It is. And that compression dramatically speeds up any subsequent classification task without sacrificing much accuracy.
That is efficiency built on mathematical insight.
All right.
Okay, second, let's look at how clustering techniques, specifically Gaussian mixture models, or GMMs, are used for practical anomaly detection.
GMMs are used to model the probability distribution and density of your data. So if you have a cluster of normal data points, anything that falls far away from that cluster in a very low density region gets flagged as an anomaly.
So if I'm running quality control on a manufacturing line, how would I apply that GMM insight?
You'd establish a density threshold.
Yeah.
If you know historically that about 2% of your products are typically defective, you can set your threshold at the second percentile of lowest density.
I see.
Anything that the model measures as having a density lower than that threshold gets flagged for inspection. It's an immediate data-driven approach to quality control.
So once we have this optimized, refined, and validated model, the final step is deployment. What do we need to ensure before we push it live?
Pre-launch is all about reproducibility. You need to ensure that anyone, anywhere can recreate your exact results. That means versioning your code, having dependency files like requirements.txt or a Docker image ready, and critically, setting random seeds to eliminate all sources of numerical variability.
If you don't set the seeds, running the exact same code twice might give you two slightly different models.
Which is a recipe for chaos in production.
Definitely. So we save the final model, maybe using a tool like JobLib, and then what are our deployment options?
The highly scalable approach is wrapping the model within a dedicated web service using a REST API.
Okay, so instead of loading the entire model directly into your main application.
The main application just sends a request to the API, and the API sends back the prediction.
That clean separation seems vital for stability.
It is. It allows you to scale the model infrastructure independently of the main application. And crucially, it means the main app can be written in literally any language: Java, C++, PHP.
And it can still easily query the model, which is typically written in Python.
Right. It cleanly separates the heavy ML lifting from the business logic.
We've covered a staggering amount of ground in this deep dive. From the historical revival of deep learning and the core paradigms of supervised and unsupervised learning,
through the practical challenges of data snooping and feature engineering,
to the necessary architectural fixes like batch normalization for complex DNNs, and finally, how to deploy a reproducible model via a web service.
And we've seen that at every single stage. From defining the problem to optimizing the algorithm, you are making a trade-off.
Always.
Trading complexity for simplicity to manage the bias-variance dilemma, or trading model speed for feature preservation during PCA compression.
That constant negotiation of power and control brings us back to complexity itself. There's a wonderful quote attributed to John von Neumann that just encapsulates the danger here.
Oh, I love this quote.
With 4 parameters, I can fit an elephant, and with 5, I can make him wiggle his trunk.
It's just a beautifully concise way to describe overfitting. Think about that statement, but apply it to a modern deep neural network.
Right.
It doesn't have 4 parameters. It might have millions or even billions. That immense flexibility means the model can literally draw an infinitely complex elephant, perfectly fitting every single piece of noise in your training data.
And that tremendous power makes regularization techniques, whether it's weight decay, early stopping, or dropping out neurons during training, absolutely non-negotiable.
They're the mechanisms that impose unnecessary friction, forcing that high-capacity model to prioritize finding generalizable patterns over just memorizing specific instances.
So the provocative question for you, the learner, is this. Given the tremendous, dangerous flexibility of a large DNN, if you were handed a brand new, complex problem, which specific regularization technique would you choose first to tame that capacity and ensure your model focuses on generalizing, not just memorizing?
Choose wisely. That decision is often the difference between a research success and a real-world deployed failure.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll catch you next time.